Hi, I'm Mark Hoth and welcome to Swift Almanac. Here we are working on our channel app, which is going to be used by you to access advanced content, sign up for one of my Swift coding boot camps, and soon get some work experience by working together on a group project. In the last lesson, we put together GitHub authentication through Firebase and got a whole heap of things operational, but the programming style was pretty poor. Now that we've got it all working, I've refactored the code, created a few data models for accessing Firebase and the GitHub APIs, and created a basic login logout function. All of this content is available in detail in my Login Basics course. So if you get stuck following this overview, check out the Basics course for in-detail explanations of Singletons, Firebase, Auth, etc. Let's have a look. Okay, so I've tidied up all the code, and now when we run it, go to our members section, and it comes up now once we're logged in with a main window, and we can log out and it takes us back to our login section. So let's have a look at the code. We have tidied up our constants and placed them globals in there, and then we've created a model for our Firebase calls and for our GitHub calls. Now I just use this naming convention where I call it my Firebase and my GitHub, just so that I know when I'm making references to things that it's my code and not the framework that's being supplied by Firebase or GitHub. So I've got these classes, and for the Firebase class, we create it as a singleton because we only need one version for the application. And then we have these two global variables. This one can be private. We've got the current user. That's an optional. If you are logged in, then that will be a value, and if you are logged out, it will be nil. And then we have this listen handler, which is an auth state did change listen handler. And essentially what happens is we have this add user listener method, and we call this add state did change listener against Firebase, and it returns back some authorization and this user variable, which is the same one as the current user here. So if the user is nil, then we're logged out, and we set this current user variable to be nil. And because we're logged out, we also need to tell GitHub that we're logged out. So we blank our access token for GitHub, and then we save the blank token because we've logged out. And next time we log in, we'll get a fresh token. And then we move to our login window. Now, if we are logged in, and we might be already logged in if we didn't log out last time, if we just close the app, we'll remain logged in. So if we're logged in, we set the current user to this user value, and then we call our GitHub class, and we load our access token, which we've saved in user defaults. And then once we've got that, we go to the main window. Now it should be the case that whenever we're logged in, we will have a user token because we're only logging in through GitHub. If we were to allow people to log in with another method like Facebook or Google, or through user ID and password, then we wouldn't be able to make these assumptions. So essentially what happens is this add state did change listener is setting up a listener with Firebase that's always checking to see whether or not we're authorized or not. So if we go outside our app and go over to GitHub, or we go to the Facebook webpage, we can log ourselves out remotely, and then this listener will know about that logout and execute this code. The other thing we need to do, since we've added the user listener, is we need to remove the listener. So here we're setting the listen handler. It gets returned when this method completes, and obviously it's saved here in this property. And if our application terminates, then we want to check that it's not equal to nil, and if we do have a value for it, then we want to remove that listener. And if you're wondering why, basically the app is registering this with Firebase, and Firebase is not going to know if our application is running or not, which is why we need to remove the listener when the application terminates. So in our app delegate, when we start off the application, we add the user listener once we've configured Firebase, and at the very bottom down here in application will terminate, we call the remove user listener method so that we can remove that listener when the app does terminate. So then the two other methods that we have so far with Firebase is we have our GitHub login and our GitHub logout, and these functions are called from the user interface. So if we're on the login page, the click git login is now just calling this login function, and when I created the main view controller, basically all it is a cut and paste of the login view controller and change the names of the parameters, and the click git logout is calling this git logout function. So within Firebase, when we log in, we get our credential just like we were before, and we signed in with that credential, and we don't really need to worry about anything here. When this, even though this is in a closure here, and it's going to return with the user and the error, because we've set this user listener, we actually get the response here as part of the listening, and that's why this code is here, and that's why there's really nothing in this code except for printing an error value. With the logout function, we just need to check that if the current user is not equal to nil, and then we get our Firebase auth, and then we try to sign out. Again, all we're doing is catching the error here. We don't process any other sign out functions within the sign out, because once we sign out, our user listener is going to return, and this enclosure is going to be run, and if the user is nil, then we are logged out, and it's going to send us back to the login screen. So it's just a little bit confusing because we're making calls here but not actually actioning the response that's being done asynchronously through these listener functions. So going into GitHub, what we've done here is, again, we've set it up as a singleton. We're only going to have one user being able to access GitHub from within the application. Now we did have this state variable that you recall, which before we just had as a string that said unguessable, but now what I've done is I've created a random number between 1 and 1,000,000 and created that as a string. So we're passing this random number as our unguessable value, because the text unguessable being constant is pretty guessable. This is just working in the login method. We're just calling the first stage where we open up a browser and send off to GitHub to get the authorization. Okay, so when the git login function returns, it's going to go back to app delegate. In app delegate, we are checking out the scheme or the URL scheme, and then we're also checking out the URL host. If that's all good, we're getting returned as parameters the code and the state. So we check that those are valid outcomes, and if they're not, we just return. We really should return false in any event. If the state is not equal to our shared state, which is our random number from here, then we're just displaying an alert that says the login's failed, secure states do not match, and just comes up with OK. This is never going to occur, but we have the code there for completion, for realistic reasons. We've got to handle all errors, and then we're going to call the GitHub authorize, and we're going to pass the code and the state that we have received. So if we look at GitHub authorize, authorize is the part where we're using Alamo Fire to make a HTTPS request with our access token, and we pass all the parameters and another return URL. And if the response is successful, this is the code we wrote last time, we're going to get our access token parameter. There are other parameters, but we only need to use the access token. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set the access token, which just sets the private variable here for the class. And then we're going to save the access token, and we're writing that to user defaults. And we have another nifty method, load access token, which we pull the saved access token out of the user defaults if we log in successfully. So that's what's going on there. In constants, it just tidied things up and created some constants. If you're looking for some of the code, the move to login window and the move to main window, I've created this extension app delegate, and I've got these as global functions. They're not part of the extension, but we'll be using this extension later, and this is a nice place to keep them because these global functions can be called anywhere from within the application. And that is basically everything. The only other thing I did do is I created the nice app icons. Go to MakeAppIcon if you want to create icons for your iPhone apps. In fact, for any smartphone app, they do Windows and Android icon sizes as well. And so that's basically everything we've done to tidy things up and make the application more professional. There you go. So now we have some code that is semi-passable. Needs some comments, but still it's a work in progress. If you have any questions about this tutorial, then leave a comment below or check out our website at www.swiftalmanac.com. Don't forget to like the lesson if you learned something and subscribe to the channel for more valuable content. It's free. See you next time. Cheers.